Hello everyone, and welcome to Module 3, Lesson 2, the Zero to Permit. In this lesson, we're going to talk about 7 practical strategies that you can use to get your permit. Throughout this seminar, we've talked about the basics of permits. We've talked about the who, the what, the when, the where, the why when it comes to permits. We've also talked about the components that make up a complete permit application. And those components are the forms, the fees, and a detailed engineering evaluation. So with that out of the way, in this module, we're going to talk about strategies. And those strategies are going to help you get your air permit. And more importantly, what do you need to do once you get your air permit? And so with that, in this lesson, we're going to share with you 7 practical strategies that we use with our clients to this day to get air permits for them. And we continue to use these strategies because they're tried and true and they still work. And so we want to share them with you within this seminar. So number 1 is to start early. Folks completely underestimate the effort and the amount of time that it takes to get an air permit. They think that the process of getting an air permit is fast. And what they actually happens is that they actually fail to take into account that the permitting process is very complex. And then because of that, they fail to incorporate that complexity into the overall project. And because of that, the overall project can go long, it could go over schedule, it could go over budget, and it can have serious repercussions for the project itself and the overall business. And so as a rule of thumb, we like to say that processing a permit application can take anywhere between 6 and 12 months or more, depending on the complexity of the project. Obviously, smaller projects may be on the shorter end, but then, as a rule of thumb, we estimate 6 to 12 months or more to get a permit. And so the rule here, or the lesson, is to have realistic expectations when it comes to the process of getting a permit. And then actually to start before you think you need to. A lot of times folks go into meetings and they say, well, we think we're going to buy this piece of equipment. And then they never attempt to talk about the permitting process because either number 1, they don't know about it, or number 2, no one brings it up. And then 3 months later, when finally someone makes a decision to buy a piece of equipment, they want the permit the next day. That's just unrealistic. And oftentimes we advise our clients, again, to start the process or getting the data needed to prepare a permit application ahead of time, and actually start before you think you need to. Because more often than not, when someone makes a decision that they want to purchase a piece of equipment or they want to modify a process, they're going to want the permit the very next day, even though those discussions may have taken place initially 2 to 3 to 6 months ago. So start before you need to. Number 2 is retain the right staff. Like we said before, the permitting process can be long and complex, but this process is needed to operate your business in compliance with all the rules and regulations of the Air District. So you're going to need to go through this process in order to expand your business in any way, shape, or form that includes adding equipment or modifying a process that emits air contaminants. It's just one of those things that you got to get familiar with, and there's no 2 ways around it. That being said, it's important that you retain the right staff, and that right staff understands the permitting process, and more importantly, how the permitting process fits. I'll say it again, within your specific operation. So a common question is, who are the right staff? That could be in-house experts on permitting, or even external consultants, or folks who have the Certified Permitting Professional or CPP designation. Now, one thing I want to note, especially when it comes to the CPP designation, is that a CPP, or someone who has a CPP, or a CPP, is not required to prepare a permit application. Anyone can prepare a permit application, but only people who are familiar with the permit application and the permitting process can prepare a complete application, and that's one that the AQMD can actually process. Now, the CPP designation is not the only way to know that they're qualified, but it's the quickest way to know if they're qualified. But there is a little bit of caveat there. It's not insurance that the person is completely qualified or understands the process. It just shows that they passed the CBP test, which suggests that they are familiar with the process. And so just because you see a CBP, you still want to question that person to sort of assess their familiarity with the permitting process. So the second step is to retain the right staff, because you want to be able to go through this process knowing what to expect, as opposed to walking into a black hole and not knowing what to expect. So retain the right staff. Number 3 is to submit all the required fees. Like we said before, insufficient fees can block a permit from being processed or being issued. And so you want to be sure that when it comes to determining your fees and actually submitting those fees, that the amount is correct. We've actually seen applications be rejected for having insufficient fees. And those fees are one of the components of a complete permit application. So number 3 is to be sure that you submit the right fees along with your permit application. Number 4 is to be sure that all the documents have the necessary signatures. Now this is important when it comes to air permits, and more specifically the forms, because in certain cases only certain people can sign the forms, and this is typically truer for Title V facilities, since the only person who can sign the forms is typically a general manager of the plant manager, the owner, or someone who's very high up. So only certain people at Title V facilities can sign these forms, and you actually need to have a form on record at the district saying who is the authorized individual to sign these forms. And so because of that, like I said, only certain people can sign the permitting forms. And so because of that, you want to coordinate with management ahead of time to know when is the application going in and when do we need it signed by. You'd hate to go through this process where you work so hard to prepare a permit application, one that's complete, has the forms, the fees, the complete engineering evaluation, it's robust, it's bulletproof, only to reach the end and to not have the right person be on site to sign the forms that's needed to submit the application. You would hate to be in that process, but it does happen. And so you should always have a backup plan when it comes to signing the forms that go into your permit application, because yes, even missing signatures can lead to delays. It's important that and then it's also important that you submit a wet signature. And so wet signatures are not digitized signatures. It's actually someone taking a pen, applying it to the piece of paper, and then signing their name. And so number 4 is you want to be sure that your forms are signed. Number 5 is to talk to the AQMD about the project ahead of time. And then I'll add a caveat, if it makes sense. And I'll say it again, if it makes sense, because not all the projects will require you to talk to the AQMD. Generally, the more complicated the project is, the more the AQMD should be involved ahead of time. And this helps because there will be times when the requirements may not be entirely clear on new source review, on emission standards, or even if this thing needs a permit in the first place. So regardless, if it makes sense, go ahead and talk to the AQMD ahead of time, or at least someone who is knowledgeable about the process or the air permitting process. In these discussions, you can talk about ways to expedite the permitting process, or even talk about what information is needed to permit the piece of equipment. Whatever the case, you never want to go into the permitting project or the permitting process and not know the requirements before you start, because it will turn into an infinite loop. You can get stuck in that loop, and it could be very costly in terms of time and in terms of time and money to break out of it. So you want to be sure that you cover all your bases before you start. Again, start before you think you need to. We've said that earlier in this lesson. Number 6 is to keep all the stakeholders informed. Permitting can cut across an entire organization. It can impact operations, it can impact maintenance, it can impact the legal side, it can impact the planning folks, it could impact the accounting and the financial folks. And so you want to be sure that everyone who needs to know about this process is aware of the process and they understand how this process is going to affect their role. You know, so I'll say it again, be sure that folks involved, so be sure that the folks involved understand the process and know what they can expect. Oftentimes we see that the root causes of many problems is simply the lack of communication or unrealistic expectations when it comes to the permitting process. And so we actually advise people to communicate liberally with all stakeholders. And in addition to that, be sure that they have realistic expectations about the permitting process and the outcome of the overall process itself. We've seen so many times where frustration and a lot of problems are caused simply by someone failing to communicate, or someone failing to communicate realistically about how long it can take the AQMD to get a permit out. And so you want to communicate liberally. And so with that, let's do a quick summary here. You know, given the fact that the permitting process is very complex, it's reassuring to know that there are things that you can do to facilitate that process. But knowing what to do requires you to know the role of the AQMD and the role of the applicant. That's you. And actually, you can implement everything that we've talked about here. You can implement everything that we've talked about in this seminar. But then to really facilitate the permitting process means that you understand two things. Number one, you understand the role of the AQMD. And the role of the AQMD is to review the permit application and the information submitted and make a determination if this piece of equipment can comply with all the rules and regulations of the Air District. That's their job. Their job is to review the application, review the information, and make a determination. Now, that's the role of the AQMD. Where do they get the information for the review? That comes from you, the applicant. So that means that the role of the applicant is to provide all that information to the AQMD to make their determination. So this is where it gets tricky. There are differing interpretations of what level of detail constitutes a complete application, or what level of detail constitutes, quote, submitting all of the information needed. You know, there's so many different interpretations of this, and we've seen it go in all different directions. And so I want to talk about this for a little bit. Because there's so many ways to interpret what is a complete application, or what level of detail constitutes a complete application, you know, it's best to simply just talk to the person who's going to review the application ahead of time and ask them, you know, what level of completeness are you looking for? What information needs to be included? It's completely subjective. What you find is that, again, people have different levels of completeness. So it's just, again, best to go straight to the person who's processing and have a discussion. You know, what information are you looking for? And take all of that and then go back and prepare a complete permit application, because preparing and submitting a complete permit application is the best thing that you can do to get your permit. So with that, let's run through this list one more time. The 7 practical strategies that you can use to get your air permit is: number 1, start early. Number 2, retain the right staff. Number 3, submit all the required fees. Number 4, be sure that all the documents have the necessary signatures. Number 5, discuss the permitting project with the AQMD ahead of time, if it makes sense. Number 6, keep all the stakeholders informed. And then number 7, just be sure that you communicate liberally. You know, communicate. And so with that, we've reached the end of Module 3, Lesson 1 of our seminar. We'll see you in Lesson 2, where we'll talk about the responsibilities, or your responsibilities, once you get your permit from the AQMD. Take care.